Beneath the calm Welsh coastline lies a house that has survived everything: scandals, ruin, obsession, near collapse, and one secret performance that almost destroyed an entire dynasty. Plas Newydd has witnessed marriages that rewrote its fate, a flamboyant aristocrat who turned a chapel into a forbidden theater, and an artist who hid illusions inside its walls. But the darkest twist comes at the very end, hidden in plain sight for decades. The story of Plas Newydd begins long before its name was ever spoken aloud, in a century when the coastline of Anglesey looked harsher, wilder, and far less forgiving than it does today. Along the northern bank of the Menai Strait, where the tides move like a breath between island and mainland, a modest fortified dwelling once stood. It was known not as Plas Newydd, nor even as a manor, only as Llywelyn Mole, a place defined by its grove of trees and its position overlooking the shifting waters. The early structure was simple, shaped more by necessity than grandeur, built to withstand weather, uncertainty, and the ebb and flow of local rivalries. Its walls were thick, its footprint small, but it held something rare: permanence in a world where most homes were made to be temporary. The first inhabitants of this coastal stronghold left almost nothing behind except the foundation of a story that would grow for centuries. They were people whose names did not travel far beyond Anglesey, but whose decisions set the trajectory for everything that followed. Llywelyn Mole was their haven, their point of strength, and the anchor of a family whose influence would expand long after the building's earliest stones were laid. It stood close enough to the strait to monitor passing boats, yet far enough inland to feel protected. At night, the wind carried the sound of waves against the rocks, and even then the house became inseparable from the landscape around it, an identity it would carry into every future version of itself. By the time the 13th century closed, the modest residence had already begun to develop an aura of significance. Local stories described it as a place that watched rather than slept, a presence observing the tides like a living guardian of the strait. The family who controlled it held land scattered across Anglesey, and Llywelyn Mole was the symbolic heart of those holdings, even if the building itself remained humble. Its owners changed through inheritance and marriage, but each generation kept their attention fixed on this single point of land, unwilling to let it slip into someone else's hands. As generations passed, the world around the residence began to shift. The old Welsh dynasties fractured, 3 centuries of landholding families rose and blended, and the kingship of England cast longer shadows across Anglesey. Llywelyn Mole survived all of it. What had begun as a defensive home now positioned itself as a place of continuity, threading one era into the next while the region's power map kept rearranging. The family that held it in the 1300s, led by Meredith Dhu, treated the property not just as a dwelling, but as an inheritance with unusual weight. Father passed land to son, and though the buildings themselves changed slowly, the significance of Llywelyn Mole grew steadily. By the time the 15th century arrived, this humble coastal home had become part of something larger, far larger than its builders could have imagined. Through a marriage that would alter the entire future of the estate, Llywelyn Mole entered the orbit of the Griffith family, one of the most influential lineages on Anglesey. With that shift, the residence stopped being merely a fortified dwelling. It became a prize, a strategic possession, and a foundation upon which new ambitions could be built. The fortunes of Llywelyn Mole no longer depended solely on its walls or the land surrounding it. They now depended on a dynasty with land, alliances, and aspirations stretching well beyond the strait. And with the arrival of the Griffiths came the first real transformation, one that would push the future Plas Newydd into an entirely new chapter, where the modest house by the water would begin its rise toward becoming one of Wales's great estates. When the Griffith family took possession of Llywelyn Mole, the property stepped into a different kind of future, one shaped not by isolated survival, but by deliberate growth, planning, and rising influence. The Griffiths were not merely landholders. They were a lineage woven into the political and social fabric of North Wales. Their presence immediately elevated the estate from a quiet coastal residence into a meaningful center of family identity and ambition. What had once been a fortified shelter began to stretch outward, gaining new rooms, new outlines, and a new purpose. Under the Griffiths, the house evolved beyond its defensive roots. The family saw potential in the property's location. its command of the Menai Strait, its access to fertile land, and its proximity to other holdings. Bit by bit, Llywelyn shifted from a rugged structure into a recognizable home. The earliest forms of true residential wings were added, modest in scale, yet significant in intention. These were not built for battle or protection. They were designed for living, for hosting, for becoming a place worthy of a prominent family's daily life. The estate began to anchor the Griffiths' presence on Anglesey, serving as a base from which they managed farms, tenant lands, and emerging alliances. As the generations passed, each successor took their turn shaping the residence. With every modification, the house became less a symbol of survival and more a reflection of status. The Griffiths invested in their properties strategically, and Llywelyn benefited from that approach. More land was cleared, additional structures were raised, storage rooms turned into receiving rooms. A hall began to take shape, a space where family business could be discussed, guests welcomed, and heritage quietly displayed. Even though the estate had not yet reached its later grandeur, a clear distinction had formed between its early utilitarian state and its new role as a seat of influence. The landscape around the house changed as well. Pathways appeared where there had once been simple tracks. Courtyards replaced open dirt spaces. Fields closest to the property were cultivated with more care, showcasing the family's success to anyone arriving by land or by boat. The house no longer blended into the background of Anglesey's coastal terrain. It stood out, recognizable, growing, and increasingly respected. What solidified the rise of the estate, however, was the Griffiths' expanding network of familial ties. Their marriages connected them to other powerful Welsh families, giving Llywelyn a deeper role within regional politics and inheritance structures. Each alliance brought new opportunity, new land, and new responsibilities. The estate was no longer just a dwelling, but a node in a much larger web of influence. It was in this world of shifting alliances and carefully crafted marriages that a pivotal union emerged, one that would redirect the entire destiny of the house. Through a match that linked the Griffiths to another lineage with significant holdings and ambitions, Llywelyn was set on a trajectory that would transform it from a comfortably expanding residence into the foundation of one of Wales's most prominent estates. The turning point in the estate's history arrived quietly, not through conquest or purchase, but through a marriage that would bind Llywelyn to an entirely new lineage. When Ellen Griffith married Nicholas Bagenal in the 16th century, the house entered a transitional stage, its ownership shifting through intertwined families and complex ties. But it was their granddaughter Anne whose union would determine the estate's true direction. Her marriage to Lewis Bailey, the Bishop of Bangor, placed the future Plas Newydd firmly into the hands of a family whose ambitions stretched far beyond the boundaries of Anglesey. With the arrival of the Baileys, the estate began shedding the final traces of its medieval simplicity. Lewis Bailey, educated, well-connected, and positioned within both ecclesiastical and social spheres, saw in the coastal residence not a modest ancestral home, but a foundation for something grander. His vision reshaped the property's identity. He was the first to call the estate Plas Newydd, New Hall, a name that signaled intention, aspiration, and a desire to redefine what the house represented. Under Bailey's direction, the first significant wave of expansion took place. What had once been a fortified house with residential additions now began to transform into a genuine country seat. New wings were outlined to accommodate guests and extended family. Storage spaces became structured rooms with defined purposes. Narrow medieval corridors were opened into broader passages that allowed for more comfortable movement. The estate shifted from a practical stronghold into a place meant to be lived in with comfort, dignity, and social presence. The improvements were not driven by extravagance, but by a clear architectural vision. Bailey wanted a home that reflected the rising status of his lineage, a residence capable of hosting influential visitors, managing affairs, and standing as a testament to a family entering the next phase of prominence. Gardens were marked out more formally, with pathways and planted areas replacing the rougher edges of earlier centuries. The house developed not only in size, but in confidence, projecting the identity of an estate stepping into its new role. As the Bailey family expanded its influence across Anglesey and Ireland, Plas Newydd became one of several estates under their control, but it held an exceptional place. It was the spiritual center of their Welsh heritage, the birthplace of their growing fortunes, and the architectural project that most clearly reflected their aspirations. Every modification, every added chamber, and every reimagined room carried the imprint of a family with a clear sense of its rising significance. By the time the next generation inherited the estate, Plas Newydd was no longer merely a coastal residence. It was the seat of a family positioned for greater titles, greater land holdings, and greater influence. The groundwork laid by Lewis Bailey, his expansions, his renaming of the estate, his ambition, created the conditions for a transformation that would soon push the property into the hands of another powerful lineage through yet another consequential inheritance. And that inheritance would connect Plas Newydd to a name that would define it for centuries: Paget. When Lewis Bailey looked upon Llywelyn Mowel, he did not see the fragmented structure inherited through generations of marriage and land transfers. He saw potential, untapped, outdated, and waiting to be reshaped. For the first time in its history, the estate was in the hands of someone who understood architecture not as a matter of fortification, but as a form of identity. And under his guidance, the modest coastal residence began its true awakening. Bailey approached the property not as a caretaker, but as a reformer. The medieval layout, with its cramped passages and uneven rooms, reflected centuries of piecemeal additions. To elevate the estate into a residence worthy of a rising family, he needed to rethink it from the inside out. His first major decision was symbolic as much as practical. He gave the estate a new name. The old Welsh designation faded, replaced by Plas Newydd, the New Hall. It was more than a title. It was a declaration that the house was stepping into a new era, guided by a man who believed deeply in legacy. The transformation began with a deliberate restructuring of the interior. Bailey introduced a plan that unified the home's scattered elements into a coherent whole. Former storage rooms became refined chambers. Narrow medieval hallways were widened, allowing light to flow more naturally through the building. Ceilings were raised where possible, and existing wooden beams were reinforced, creating spaces that felt open rather than defensive. Instead of adapting to the old architecture, Bailey bent the old structure toward his vision, creating a residence suitable for gatherings, discussions, and the everyday rhythm of a family with ambition. New residential wings formed the next phase of expansion. These were not extravagant constructions, but carefully designed extensions that introduced true symmetry to the estate for the first time. They allowed the house to accommodate visiting clergy, allied families, and members of the growing Bailey lineage. Rooms were made larger and more private, showcasing a shift from communal medieval living to a more modern, structured household. The estate's shape finally began echoing the architectural language of the early modern period, a place where hosting guests and displaying heritage were just as important as providing shelter. Outdoor changes followed, giving the estate the first hints of formal landscaping. Paths were laid with intention, courtyards were reorganized, and outdoor spaces began serving not merely practical needs but aesthetic ones. Plas Newydd was no longer content to exist beside the Menai Strait. It wanted to command attention from it. What made Bailey's work so impactful was not just the scale of his changes, but the clarity of the identity he carved into the estate. For the first time, Plas Newydd had a personality, a quiet confidence, a sense of balance, and the beginnings of the elegance that would define it in centuries to come. His redesign marked the moment when the house stopped being an inheritance and became a statement. By the time his successors walked its halls, the estate possessed not only a new name, but a new character. And with each generation of Baileys building upon the foundation he established, Plas Newydd began moving steadily toward a future where its architectural ambitions would rise even higher, ultimately setting the stage for the arrival of a family whose influence and fortune would transform the house once again. The generations that followed Lewis Bailey inherited not only the physical structure he shaped, but also the momentum of a rising estate. What had begun as a thoughtful renovation now expanded into a broader vision, one that increasingly tied Plas Newydd to a growing network of lands, titles, and responsibilities. As each successor stepped into their role, the house gained new significance, slowly turning from a coastal residence into the central hub of a family whose influence was spreading far beyond the shores of Anglesey. The Bailey descendants were administrators, landowners, and statesmen who understood the power of geography as well as lineage. Their holdings multiplied through careful inheritances and strategic marriages, stretching across Anglesey and reaching deep into Ireland. Plas Newydd became the Welsh anchor of a family whose wealth no longer depended solely on local farms or regional alliances. The estate evolved into the administrative heart of a growing domain, where decisions about land management, tenancies, agricultural revenue, and legal affairs were routinely made. As the family expanded its reach, the estate itself responded with architecture. What Bailey had begun, transforming the medieval home into a modern residence, was now taken further by heirs who wanted the house to reflect the scale of their new responsibilities. Additional rooms were added for estate officers, stewards, and visiting landholders. The house grew horizontally, developing a footprint more akin to a European manor than the coastal stronghold it had once been. Its interior spaces were refined with subtle touches that signaled the family's rising status. Improved woodwork, larger hearths, more spacious receiving rooms, and increasingly formalized private quarters. The grounds surrounding the estate expanded in parallel. Fields once managed for local sustenance now formed part of a continental network of agricultural income. Lands in Ireland, acquired through Bailey marriages and political connections, brought in new revenues and further elevated the family's profile. Plas Newydd became the symbolic center of these holdings, the place where accounts were reviewed, correspondence drafted, and decisions affecting thousands of acres made. This growth also led to a shift in lifestyle. The house transitioned from being simply a residence to becoming a place where the rhythm of an entire estate could be felt. Carriages arrived at its entrance more frequently, bearing visitors from across Wales and Ireland. Formal dinners, strategic conversations, and seasonal gatherings became common, giving Plas Newydd a social rhythm that matched its administrative importance. The estate was no longer just lived in, it was used, actively, purposefully, and confidently. For the Baileys, each new inheritance added another layer of responsibility and opportunity, and the estate's evolution mirrored that upward trajectory. The house continued to stretch and adapt, its identity tied directly to the fortunes of the family shaping it. By the 18th century, Plas Newydd stood at the center of a vast network of lands and titles, a residence that no longer reflected its humble origins, but instead embodied the full scale of the Bailey family's ambitions. And yet, the greatest transformation was still ahead. One key inheritance, passing through the maternal line, was about to bring the estate into the hands of a name that would elevate it even further. The next chapter would see Plas Newydd tied to a lineage with historic titles, military prestige, and the resources to reshape the estate on a scale never before imagined. The moment Plas Newydd entered the orbit of the Paget family marked one of the most dramatic turning points in its entire history. What had begun as a Welsh coastal estate, shaped by centuries of local families, was suddenly pulled into the gravitational field of a lineage whose influence reached across England. The transition began quietly, through inheritance rather than ceremony, when Henry Bailey, a descendant of the Bailey line on his mother's side, became the beneficiary of an extraordinary legacy. With the passing of distant relatives who held the barony of Paget, vast estates and historic titles converged upon him, bringing with them not just wealth, but an entirely new identity. In 1769, Henry Bailey legally transformed himself into Henry Paget, taking the surname of the powerful line he had unexpectedly been chosen to continue. This change was more than symbolic. It marked the beginning of a dynasty that would dominate the history of Plas Newydd for the next 2 centuries. The estate was no longer simply the Welsh seat of the Baileys. It became a critical component of the Paget inheritance, a residence that now sat within a sprawling empire of landholdings that stretched from Anglesey to Staffordshire, from local Welsh estates to English ancestral properties with histories of their own. The acquisition of the Paget inheritance brought remarkable wealth and authority. Henry became the 9th Baron Paget, inheriting Beaudesert, a significant English estate, and absorbing the responsibilities and expectations attached to his new title. Plas Newydd now had to reflect this elevated position. The estate was not just a family home anymore. It became part of the visual narrative of a rising aristocratic power, one that combined old Welsh roots with English nobility. Its halls hosted new conversations, ones involving political influence, military connections, and the careful management of a rapidly expanding portfolio of lands. This shift also altered the internal rhythm of life at the estate. The Pagets carried with them a legacy of service to the crown, military distinction, and national visibility. Their presence brought new expectations, new circles of visitors, and new ambitions. The house needed to stand as proudly as the name it now represented, projecting stability, refinement, and authority. While earlier generations had expanded Plas Newydd to accommodate growing lands and administrative needs, the Pagets required a residence that communicated status as clearly as comfort. Henry Paget's role as the newly appointed Lord Lieutenant of Anglesey further raised the estate's prominence. Plas Newydd gradually transformed into a site of regional leadership and ceremonial importance, where official gatherings and strategic meetings would now be hosted. The atmosphere of the house changed, acquiring a polish that reflected the responsibilities of a family seated at the intersection of local governance and national aristocracy. As the Paget name settled into its new Welsh home, it became evident that the estate would soon need a transformation equal in scale to the ambitions of its owners. It was no longer enough for Plas Newydd to be a comfortable residence or even a well-managed family estate. It had to become an architectural statement, one capable of standing alongside the great country houses of Britain and reflecting the prestige of a lineage rising rapidly through the ranks of the aristocracy. And so, the stage was set for the next great evolution of Plas Newydd, driven by the resources, vision, and determination of a family prepared to reshape the estate with a boldness never before seen on its ancient shores. The arrival of the Pagets brought status and authority to Plas Newydd, but it was the vision of one architect, James Wyatt, that transformed the estate into a masterpiece. When Henry Paget, now firmly established as the head of a growing aristocratic dynasty, sought to elevate his Welsh seat to match the scale of his newfound power, he called upon Wyatt, one of the most respected architects of the late 18th century. What followed was nothing short of a reinvention, a complete reimagining of the house from a collection of evolving structures into a unified architectural statement. Wyatt approached Plas Newydd with the eye of a sculptor and the mind of a strategist. He studied the estate's medieval remnants, the expansions of the Baileys, the early refinements of Lewis Bailey, and the uneven additions that had accumulated over centuries. Instead of preserving their differences, he sought to harmonize them, molding the house into a single, cohesive form. His first bold move involved the towers, structures that once stood apart as relics of older defensive architecture. Wyatt blended them seamlessly into the main façade, integrating them so elegantly that they appeared as intentional elements rather than remnants of a fractured past. With this integration, the estate gained something it had never truly possessed: symmetry. Wyatt introduced classical balance to the exterior, giving the house the poised, measured proportions associated with stately homes across Britain. Smooth lines replaced abrupt transitions, windows aligned with architectural precision. The structure now carried the calm authority of a residence designed to convey status, not merely shelter. Visitors approaching from the entrance road saw not a building shaped by centuries of necessity, but a polished composition, confident, orderly, and unmistakably grand. Wyatt's design extended far beyond the main facade. He orchestrated a series of renovations that touched nearly every corner of the estate. Rooms were reorganized to create a natural, intuitive flow, allowing residents and guests to move through the house without feeling the jarring contrasts of earlier construction phases. The interiors adopted a more refined tone, characterized by proportion, grace, and a subtle grandeur that reflected the Paget's rising social position. Outside, Wyatt's influence became even more transformative. Recognizing the importance of supporting buildings in defining an estate's character, he designed an impressive Gothic-style stable block, a structure so striking that it stood as a secondary architectural marvel in its own right. This new complex not only served practical purposes, but also framed the estate as a complete, functional, and unified property. Lodges and gateways were constructed to complement the new aesthetic, turning the estate's boundaries into architectural statements that signaled prestige long before one reached the main house. With these sweeping changes, Plas Newydd stepped confidently into a new identity. It was no longer just an ancestral residence with layers of history. It was now an icon, a house that stood proudly among the great country estates of Britain. Wyatt had taken the scattered ambitions of previous centuries and molded them into a clear, sophisticated vision. The estate became not only the heart of the Paget family, but a symbol of their authority, refinement, and cultural standing. Yet the story did not end with architectural elegance. As the 19th century approached, the house would soon become the backdrop for one of the United Kingdom's most famous military figures, an heir whose personal legacy would intertwine with the estate's evolving grandeur, pushing Plas Newydd into yet another extraordinary chapter. When Henry William Paget inherited Plas Newydd, the estate gained not just a new master, but a figure whose name would soon echo through British history. Even before the Battle of Waterloo etched his legacy into the national imagination, Paget was already a distinguished military commander, bold, charismatic, and renowned for his leadership across various European campaigns. But it was Waterloo that transformed him from a respected officer into a hero whose fame shaped the identity of the house he called home. In 1815, as commander of the British cavalry, Paget led one of the most dramatic charges of the battle, pushing his troops into the heart of the conflict with a force that stunned both allies and enemies. His bravery became legendary, and although he suffered the loss of a leg from one of the final cannon shots of the day, his composure and courage in the aftermath only amplified his reputation. Stories circulated across Britain of the commander who reportedly remarked on the injury with calm humor, embodying a spirit the nation admired. In recognition of his service and his sacrifice, he was elevated to the newly created title of Marquess of Anglesey, placing him among the most distinguished members of the British aristocracy. Plas Newydd now found itself at the center of this rising prestige. The estate became the official residence of the Marquess, and with that shift came a new layer of significance. The house, already transformed by Wyatt's architectural brilliance, now served as the home of a national figure, a leader celebrated in newspapers, honored in Parliament, admired by soldiers, and discussed throughout the country. Visitors arrived at the estate with heightened curiosity, eager to see where the celebrated cavalry commander lived, worked, and recovered. To honor the Marquess's achievements, a monumental tribute soon rose on the landscape surrounding Plas Newydd. A towering column, nearly 30 meters high, was erected just north of the estate, a striking landmark overlooking the Menai Strait. It stood as both a symbol of national gratitude and a permanent marker of the Paget legacy on Anglesey. Visible from the surrounding hills and waters, the column became an inseparable part of the estate's identity, linking the house to one of the most defining moments in British military history. Life at Plas Newydd during this era carried a new rhythm. The house hosted military figures, political leaders, and prominent guests who traveled to meet the Marquess and experience the estate at the height of its influence. The atmosphere inside the residence reflected both dignity and purpose. Rooms once designed for comfort now bore the weight of national events and strategic conversations. Portraits, letters, and mementos connected to the Marquess's campaigns filled the halls, turning the house into a quiet repository of history. Yet beneath the grandeur, the estate remained deeply personal for the Pagets. It was here that the Marquess spent time with his family, where he returned between public duties and where the landscape provided a sense of continuity after the turbulence of war. The house became a place where national legacy and private life intersected, each shaping the narrative of the other. As the decades moved on, the Paget line continued to evolve, and new generations left their mark on the estate. But the era of the first Marquess would forever stand as one of the most defining chapters in the history of Plas Newydd, an era when the estate became not merely an architectural masterpiece, but the home of a man whose story became part of Britain's collective memory. And as the 19th century unfolded, the estate would soon encounter another dramatic shift, one not born of military triumph, but of extravagance, performance, and a very different kind of legacy that would once again transform the house from within. By the late 19th century, Plas Newydd, once shaped by soldiers, statesmen, and architects, entered one of its most unusual and flamboyant eras. the estate passed to Henry Cyril Paget, the fifth Marquess of Anglesey, a man whose personality seemed to defy the expectations placed on an aristocrat of his standing. While his predecessors had built their reputations on governance, military honor, and administrative discipline, the new Marquess lived for performance, spectacle, and the thrill of reinvention. Under his ownership, Plas Newydd became something no one could have predicted. A private world of theatricality where the boundaries between residence and stage all but disappeared. The house, so long a symbol of heritage and lineage, suddenly pulsed with an entirely different energy. Henry Cyril Paget earned a reputation that spread far beyond Anglesey. Newspapers would later call him the Dancing Marquess, a nickname that captured both his charm and his extravagance. He embraced performance as a lifestyle, surrounding himself with costumes, lights, actors, and music. And at the center of his vision stood the transformation that would become one of the most legendary episodes in the estate's history: the conversion of the family chapel into a private theater. What had once been a quiet, reverent space became the Gaiety Theater, a room designed to astonish anyone fortunate enough to enter it. Velvet draperies replaced religious panels, elaborate lighting filled the corners. Rows of seats faced a small but ambitious stage, engineered to host plays, dances, dramatic readings, and performances in which the Marquess often took the lead role himself. The chapel's spiritual silence gave way to applause, music, and the unmistakable thrill of performance. Guests invited to the estate found themselves immersed in evenings that felt almost dreamlike, set within the walls of a house that, for centuries, had known only tradition and restraint. The new theater was not the only sign of dramatic change. Across the estate, spending escalated rapidly. Clothing, jewelry, imported fabrics, custom-designed costumes, theatrical props, and ornate furnishings filled rooms that had once served more practical needs. The halls of Plas Newydd shimmered with opulence, each object chosen not for its heritage value, but for its ability to add flair to the life that the Marquess imagined for himself. The estate, at least for a brief period, became a living stage, every corridor a backdrop, every room a setting, every gathering a performance. For those who lived and worked on the estate, it was an era of contradictions. On one hand, the house had never seen such color, creativity, or exuberance. On the other, the financial strain was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The Marquess's lifestyle demanded constant reinvention, new shows, new decorations, new comforts, and the cost of maintaining this vibrant world far outpaced the estate's resources. The Paget fortune, already stretched by previous generations, struggled to sustain the pace of spending and the theatrics that had come to define Plas Newydd under its most flamboyant owner. Yet, even as expenses grew, the estate's atmosphere carried a sense of surreal magic. Nights filled with performances blurred together, leaving behind lingering traces of laughter, costumes, and the soft echo of applause in rooms illuminated by candlelight. The house, transformed by the Marquess's imagination, felt momentarily removed from the outside world, as if suspended in a dream created by a man determined to live life as a continuous spectacle. But such a spectacle could not last forever. As the turn of the century approached, the consequences of the Marquess's choices began to unfold, pushing the estate toward a financial reality from which performance alone could not escape. The era of theatrical brilliance was drawing to a close, preparing the house for yet another transformation, one driven not by extravagance or art, but by the urgent need to bring the estate back from the edge. And with the arrival of the next generation, Plas Newydd would once again reinvent itself, stepping out of the glow of the stage lights and into a new chapter of restoration, discipline, and reordering. The dazzling world crafted by the fifth Marquess faded almost instantly after his passing, leaving behind not applause but account books filled with impossible numbers. The estate that had once basked in theatrical brilliance now faced a very different kind of drama, one measured not in costume changes or encore performances, but in mounting debts and the stark realities that followed. When the financial records were finally opened, the scale of the challenge became undeniable. Years of indulgence had drained the family's reserves, and the burden of correcting the course fell squarely upon the shoulders of Charles Paget, the sixth Marquess of Anglesey. His inheritance was not a flourishing estate, but a financial storm. Bills accumulated during the extravagant years far exceeded what the estate's lands and farms could generate. The family, long accustomed to a life supported by tradition and wide-reaching holdings, now faced an uncomfortable truth. Their wealth was no longer sustainable. What had once been a network of properties across England, Wales, and Ireland was at risk of unraveling piece by piece. To save what he could, the sixth Marquess embarked on a series of difficult decisions that would redefine the future of the Paget lineage. The first steps involved liquidating assets, properties that had been part of the family for generations, each carrying memories, stories, and historical weight. The proud Beaudesert estate in Staffordshire, once a principal residence of aristocratic grandeur, was sold. Irish lands that had sustained Bailey and Paget fortunes for decades were transferred to new owners. Even the family's London house, a symbol of social presence in the capital, was relinquished in an effort to stabilize the bleeding finances. Each sale was a quiet surrender of a chapter of the family's history. Contracts were signed, keys were handed over, and slowly, the vast empire that had once stretched confidently across the British Isles began to contract. With every loss, the importance of Plas Newydd grew. As properties fell away, the Anglesey estate remained, standing not only as a home, but as the last anchor of the family's identity. Its walls, shaped by centuries of inheritance, architecture, and ambition, carried responsibility they had never held before. Within Plas Newydd itself, practical changes followed. The new Marquess removed the theatrical elements left behind by his predecessor, dismantling the Gaiety Theatre and restoring parts of the house to a more functional, restrained form. Furnishings were evaluated, inventories reviewed, and the estate's remaining staff adapted to a more disciplined household rhythm. The atmosphere shifted from performance to preservation. While earlier generations had indulged in expansion and artistic flourish, the sixth Marquess focused on endurance, ensuring that the estate could survive, even as the rest of the family's holdings disappeared. Despite the scale of the losses, Plas Newydd gained something unexpected during this period: clarity. With fewer competing demands from distant properties and fewer resources spread across scattered estates, the family's attention narrowed to the house overlooking the Menai Strait. It became the heart of the Paget identity, the one place that remained untouched by the upheaval of sales and debts. Its landscapes, halls, and foundations became a reminder of endurance, not extravagance. And as the estate settled into its role as the family's final stronghold, the next steps required something beyond financial discipline. Plas Newydd needed renewal, not through opulence but through thoughtful modernization that could carry it into the future. The stage was set for another transformation, one that would reshape the house once again, not through showmanship or desperation, but through a sober and determined effort to preserve the legacy that had survived everything else. The work that awaited the sixth Marquess was not glamorous, nor was it meant to impress visitors with grandeur. It was a mission of survival, one that required reshaping Plas Newydd into a residence capable of functioning in a world where family fortunes had dramatically contracted. The theatrical glow left behind by his predecessor had to be replaced with clear-headed pragmatism. And so began a period of restructuring that would give the estate a new identity, not driven by ambition or spectacle, but by the necessity of efficiency, durability, and long-term stability. The most symbolic change came with the removal of the decorative crenellations that wrapped the roofline. These ornamental battlements had long given the estate a romantic, castle-like silhouette, a visual echo of its medieval past, but they served no practical purpose and required costly upkeep. Under the sixth Marquess, they were taken down, altering the estate's profile and bringing it closer to a streamlined, modern appearance. The house that once projected theatrical fantasy now evolved into a form that reflected responsibility, restraint, and realism. Inside, the work became even more transformative. The Gaiety Theatre, once the vibrant heart of the fifth Marquess's world, was dismantled. Its ornate decorations, its stage, and its velvet curtains were removed to restore functionality to the interior spaces. Rooms absorbed into the theater's footprint were returned to practical use. What had been an indulgent monument to performance now became a series of sober, adaptable areas suited for everyday tasks and staff operations. The house shed the extravagance that had nearly overwhelmed it, replacing it with a clarity that matched its new financial reality. The service areas, long shaped by centuries of inconsistent expansions, were reorganized. The sixth Marquess understood that the estate's future depended on rationalizing the parts of the house that visitors rarely saw. 3 small servants' rooms were merged to create a spacious, more efficient dining room, one better suited to a household that could no longer support the vast staffs of earlier generations. Storage spaces were reallocated to meet modern needs, and hallways were adjusted to create cleaner routes for movement throughout the building. The goal was not aesthetic beauty, but coherence, a house that worked rather than merely impressed. A covered roof was added over the service courtyard, a practical solution that reduced exposure to weather and allowed the staff to operate more smoothly. What had once been an open utilitarian space became sheltered and structured, signaling a shift toward a more organized, sustainable way of managing the estate. The entire service wing began to function as a coordinated system rather than a patchwork of outdated rooms. Outside, the grounds underwent changes that reflected this new era. The estate's exterior no longer aimed to overwhelm with dramatic flourishes. Instead, paths were tidied, yards were reorganized, and the surrounding spaces were adapted to support a household that needed reliability above all else. The goal was continuity, preserving what remained without inviting unnecessary strain on the estate's shrinking resources. Through all these adjustments, Plas Newydd gained something valuable: a renewed sense of purpose. The house, for the first time in its centuries-long evolution, was shaped primarily around practicality rather than status. It emerged from its period of reinvention not as a monument to extravagance or aristocratic display, but as a residence prepared to endure. And just as practicality began to define its structure, a different kind of inspiration arrived at the estate in the decades ahead. An artist would soon enter its halls, an imaginative force whose vision would leave a mark more enduring than any theatrical production. The next transformation would not be one of necessity, but of creativity, breathing new life into the house that had fought so hard to survive. The arrival of Rex Whistler at Plas Newydd marked a dramatic shift in the atmosphere of the estate. After years defined by practicality, austerity, and the careful rebuilding of stability, the house suddenly opened its doors to a different kind of influence, a burst of creativity that would leave an imprint deeper than architecture or lineage. Whistler was young, imaginative, and already gaining a reputation as one of Britain's most promising artists. His visits in the 1930s brought a sense of lightness and renewal into a house that had spent decades recovering from financial strain and the dismantling of its more extravagant past. Whistler did not come merely as a hired artist, but as a guest and friend of the Paget family. His presence breathed energy into Plas Newydd's halls. The elegant symmetry crafted by Wyatt, the practical renovations enforced by the sixth Marquess, and the lingering memories of earlier eras all inspired him. He wandered through rooms that had been shaped by centuries of history, studied the views across the Menai Strait, and immersed himself in the rhythms of the estate. Each visit strengthened his connection to the house, transforming him from an observer into a contributor to its unfolding story. One of his earliest gifts to the estate was a series of portraits, most notably those of Lady Caroline Paget, whose charisma and poise captivated Whistler. His paintings of her captured not only her appearance, but the quiet radiance she brought into the rooms she inhabited. These portraits became part of the emotional fabric of the estate, contributing to a growing sense that Plas Newydd was entering a new artistic chapter, one defined by intimacy as much as grandeur. But it was Whistler's next project that would become the crown jewel of his time at the estate. The Paget family invited him to create a grand mural in the dining room, a task that challenged not only his artistic ability, but his understanding of scale. He accepted with enthusiasm, recognizing the rare opportunity to shape an entire interior around a single vision. What began as a commission soon transformed into an immersive creative journey. The mural he designed was unlike anything Britain had seen. Spanning 17.5 meters, it was the largest canvas painting in the country, yet its impact went far beyond size. Whistler crafted a trompe-l'oeil masterpiece that played with illusion and perspective, blurring the boundaries between reality and imagination. The scene blended elements of Snowdonia with whimsical Italianate details, church towers, distant harbors, theatrical skies, and clever architectural tricks that shifted depending on where the viewer stood. From one angle, the horizon stretched outward. From another, details seemed to shift or retreat, creating a constantly evolving visual experience. Every brushstroke carried intention. Whistler embedded subtle jokes, hidden objects, and playful distortions, inviting viewers to discover new details with each visit. The mural turned the dining room into a living artwork, a space where the walls no longer confined the room, but extended it into a dreamlike landscape. It was a scene that matched the estate's long history of imagination, from the theatrical ambitions of the fifth Marquess to the architectural visions of Wyatt, but expressed with a depth and refinement that surpassed them all. Working on such a vast project required time, presence, and immersion. Whistler became a familiar figure at Plas Newydd, moving between the dining room and the surrounding landscapes for inspiration. The estate's views, its shifting light, and even its architectural lines found their way into the composition. Plas Newydd and Whistler shaped one another, the house giving the artist its atmosphere, and the artist giving the house a legacy that would define it for generations. By the time the mural was completed, it had woven itself into the identity of Plas Newydd. It was not merely decoration, it was a testament to creativity at a scale few artists ever achieved. Visitors who stepped into the dining room entered a world both connected to and separate from the estate around it, a world that elevated Plas Newydd into a place of artistic pilgrimage. And as the house embraced this new grandeur, the stage was set for the final chapters of its evolution, chapters in which Plas Newydd would step beyond the hands of its owners and into a future shaped by preservation, public admiration, and enduring cultural significance. Between 1936 and 1938, the dining room at Plas Newydd ceased to be a simple interior space and became something entirely different, an immersive world shaped by Rex Whistler's imagination. The transformation unfolded slowly, brushstroke by brushstroke, as the artist turned a blank expanse of wall into a portal that dissolved the boundaries of the room itself. What emerged over those 2 years was not merely a mural, but a full-scale illusion, a trompe-l'oeil masterpiece that redefined how a house could hold art and how art could reshape the atmosphere of a home. Whistler began with a vision that blended reality with fantasy. He drew inspiration from the landscapes visible outside the estate's windows, the dramatic peaks of Snowdonia rising over the Menai Strait, and reimagined them through a lens of romanticism, whimsy, and theatrical distortion. In his composition, familiar Welsh mountains flowed into distant horizons, merging seamlessly with scenes inspired by Italian harbors and classical architecture. Towering church spires rose near imagined seawalls, while gentle waves lapped against an invented shoreline. Each element was positioned with intention, encouraging the viewer to question where the real world ended and Whistler's world began. The genius of the mural lay not only in its scale, an enormous 17.5-meter sweep of canvas covering an entire wall, but in its ability to manipulate the eye. Whistler embedded subtle tricks into the composition, playing with perspective in ways that created shifting illusions. A tower that seemed distant from one angle appeared suddenly closer from another. An archway that looked perfectly symmetrical revealed a playful distortion upon closer inspection. Shadows fell where no physical light source existed, and architectural details appeared three-dimensional despite being entirely flat. The mural invited viewers not simply to observe, but to explore. Whistler treated the room as a stage set, layering the composition with secret jokes, tiny characters, and details that could easily be missed during a first visit. A cat perched on a ledge. A rigging rope hung at an impossible angle. A piece of masonry seemed to protrude just beyond its painted frame. Guests found themselves drawn into conversation about the mural's mysteries, pointing out illusions and discovering new anomalies each time they dined beneath it. The room developed its own quiet energy, an interplay between the stillness of the space and the vibrant world Whistler had created within it. As the mural grew, the room around it changed. Furniture was carefully chosen to complement the painting's palette, and the natural light from the windows interacted with the composition in unexpected ways. Morning light made the distant mountains appear softer. Evening light deepened the harbor shadows, enhancing the sense of depth. The dining room became a living environment, reacting to the time of day, the movement of people, and the shifting moods of the house. For the Paget family, the mural became far more than artistic decoration. It transformed the dining room into the emotional heart of the estate, a place where meals became experiences, conversations unfolded under painted skies, and visitors felt transported far beyond the walls that surrounded them. Whistler had given the house a gift that no financial restoration or architectural renovation could replicate, a new soul, one born from imagination rather than inheritance. By the time the mural was completed, Plas Newydd possessed something unique in all of Britain. No other country house held an artwork of such scale, complexity, and charm. It stood as a testament to creativity woven directly into the fabric of the estate, a reminder that even after centuries of architectural transformation, the house was still capable of reinventing itself in ways no one could have foreseen. And soon, the estate would face another turning point, one not shaped by artists or aristocrats, but by the changing tides of the 20th century. The mural, vibrant and unchanging, would remain a silent witness as Plas Newydd approached the moment when it would finally pass out of private hands and begin its public life under the guardianship of the National Trust. By the mid-20th century, Plas Newydd found itself standing on the edge of another transformation, one quieter than theatrical reinvention, but far heavier in its implications. The tide of British society was shifting, and with it, the foundations that had sustained aristocratic families for centuries began to erode. The weight of vast estates, once symbols of power and permanence, now became a burden that even long-established families struggled to bear. Plas Newydd, with its sweeping grounds, expansive woodlands, and centuries of layered history, was no exception. The estate had survived countless transitions: marriages, inheritances, expansions, financial crises, and artistic renaissances. But the new pressures of the 20th century were different. They arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, carried by changing taxes, shifting cultural values, and the diminishing role of the aristocracy in public life. Maintaining a grand country house required staff, upkeep, renovations, and continuous investment, demands that grew more difficult as old sources of income faded and agricultural revenues declined. The world that had once sustained estates like Plas Newydd was disappearing, replaced by a Britain redefining itself after periods of conflict and rapid modernization. For the Pagets, Plas Newydd remained deeply meaningful, yet increasingly challenging. The family continued to care for the estate, walking through halls lined with portraits of ancestors who had shaped its story. But the cost of preserving such a vast property pushed their resources to the limit. Repairs became more frequent, modernization more necessary, and the sheer scale of the estate more demanding. The grounds needed constant attention, the house demanded structural care, and the artworks, including Whistler's extraordinary mural, required specialized conservation. Each passing year made it clearer that the estate could no longer rely solely on private means. The decline was not dramatic or sudden, but took the form of gradual exhaustion. Some rooms were closed to save on heating. Portions of the grounds received less attention than they once had. The once expansive staff was reduced, leaving fewer hands to maintain the rhythms of daily estate life. Even as the house remained dignified, its grandeur increasingly masked the strain behind the scenes. Within the family, conversations grew more serious. The emotional attachment to Plas Newydd was strong. This was the place that held generations of memories, triumphs, and transformations. But sentiment alone could not meet the rising costs. The realities of the time pushed the Pagets into facing a question that had once been unthinkable. How could the estate be preserved when the means to sustain it were no longer sufficient? And yet, even as the challenges mounted, Plas Newydd maintained its quiet resilience. The house stood firm above the Menai Strait, its façade still carrying the symmetry crafted by Wyatt, its interiors still echoing the footsteps of centuries. The mural continued to illuminate the dining room with Whistler's dreamlike illusions. The gardens, though no longer as meticulously managed as before, still held the spirit of the estate's long story. But the family understood that the era of private stewardship was reaching its natural conclusion. The pressures of the modern age were too great, and Plas Newydd deserved more than survival on dwindling resources. It needed protection, restoration, and a future that could honor its past while ensuring that the house remained alive in the present. That realization led to the most consequential decision in the estate's modern history, a decision that would shift Plas Newydd from a private legacy to a national treasure, opening a new chapter in which its preservation would finally be secured. The house that had endured centuries of reinvention was about to enter a new era, one defined not by aristocratic lineage, but by collective guardianship and public admiration. In 1976, a chapter closed and another quietly opened as Plas Newydd passed from private inheritance into public stewardship. After centuries of remaining within the hands of one extended family, shaped by the Griffiths, the Baileys, and finally the Pagets, the estate found a new guardian in the National Trust, an organization dedicated to preserving places of historic and cultural significance across Britain. This transition was not a surrender of legacy, but a recognition of necessity, an acknowledgement that the house required a wider embrace to secure its future. And with this decision, Plas Newydd entered a new era, one defined not by aristocratic ambitions, but by shared responsibility and renewed life. The moment the estate came under the Trust's care, the work of revitalization began. Teams of conservators, historians, architects, and gardeners stepped into a house that had endured centuries of transformation and strain. They examined every beam, every wall, every inch of Whistler's mural, every artifact, every corridor shaped by earlier generations. The goal was not to restore Plas Newydd to any single period, but to preserve the story of all its eras, to honor the medieval roots of Llywelyn Mole, the architectural vision of Wyatt, the theatrical extravagance of the fifth Marquess, the disciplined reinvention of the sixth, and the artistic brilliance brought by Whistler. Repairs were made to stabilize the structure. Gardens were revitalized, their paths opened once more for visitors. Rooms that had long been closed due to financial constraints were carefully restored and illuminated with historical context, transforming private spaces into narratives accessible to everyone. The dining room, anchored by the Great Whistler mural, became one of the estate's crown jewels, a place where the past remained vividly alive, its illusions as captivating to modern visitors as they had been to the Paget family nearly half a century earlier. As Plas Newydd opened to the public, it revealed itself not just as a historic building, but as a living archive of layered identities. People arrived from across Wales, Britain, and beyond, walking through hallways once trodden by soldiers, artists, aristocrats, and servants. They stood beneath the same ceilings that had witnessed private conversations, family dinners, theatrical performances, and strategic decisions that shaped the course of the estate's long existence. The house, once accessible only to a privileged few, became a shared cultural treasure, a place where personal memory gave way to collective experience. Over the years, Plas Newydd grew into one of the most visited sites under the National Trust's care. Its position overlooking the Menai Strait, its sweeping gardens, its woodland trails, and the layers of history embedded in its walls created a profound sense of place. Visitors came for the architecture, for the art, for the history, or simply for the feeling of walking through a home that had lived many lives. Each generation discovered something new to appreciate: the medieval heart of the estate, the Georgian refinements, the Victorian transformations, the modern artistic spirit of Whistler's creation. What makes Plas Newydd extraordinary is not just the richness of its past, but its resilience. The estate has survived the rise and fall of dynasties, the influence of powerful figures, the strain of debts, the exuberance of artistic indulgence, and the quiet challenges of modern life. It has weathered political shifts, economic pressures, and personal dramas without losing its core identity. Through every upheaval, the house adapted, reinvented, and endured. Today, Plas Newydd stands not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a place that continues to breathe. Its walls hold stories that stretch across 7 centuries, stories preserved not through isolation, but through shared stewardship. And perhaps that is why the estate continues to draw people in. It embodies the idea that history is not static, but ever-evolving, shaped by countless hands, countless decisions, countless moments of ambition, creativity, struggle, and renewal. In the end, Plas Newydd survives because it has always been more than a house. It is a witness to time, a testament to reinvention, and a reminder that even as worlds change and families rise and fall, places with true character find ways to endure, living on in every visitor who walks through their doors.